Let's get more on all of this from Mark Meirowitz, who is a foreign policy analyst. He joins us now live from New York. Mark, great to have you back. In terms of the agreement between Russia's President Vladimir Putin and Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, on Russia's part, is this sincere or just lip service?
Well, I don't know if it's either. Russia always pursues its own interests. It has an interest to remain in Syria and maintain its bases in Tartus, Latakia, and to support the Syrian regime. That makes its goals completely asymmetric or different than Turkey's goals, which leads me to be very concerned about the agreement that was made between Turkey and Russia. I'm happy about the ceasefire. That's very important. But this ongoing agreement going forward is fraught with risk, particularly for Turkey. The problem for Turkey is that it cannot become ensconced and stuck in Syria. It looks like that's happening. I call that Turkey's Vietnam. It's very dangerous for Turkey. Turkey needs to have an exit plan, not to extricate, to be able to extricate itself from this continuing deteriorating situation. Yes, short term, you do have the ceasefire. Long term, very problematic. Where it needs to go is to work with NATO and the United States to formulate a solution and not to depend on Russia. Because as we've seen, Russia's interests diverge from Turkey.
Turkey has, Mark, turned toward NATO and the United States on all of this, but it doesn't appear to be getting the results and the kind of support that it is seeking. What else could Turkey do at this point?
Well, first of all, the key thing is to be able to get the Patriots, and I think I'm going to be hopeful that that will be doable. And that needs to be done in order to find an alternative to the S-400. Now, let's be realistic about U.S. foreign policy right now. President Trump is completely preoccupied with the coronavirus in the United States. The entire federal government, that's executive, Congress, you name it, is devoted to deal with this tremendous crisis. Accordingly, all focus is on that and not on foreign policy. Nevertheless, Trump does not want to have a foreign policy explosion. So he's going, I'm sure, through NATO to work with Turkey. And of course, Trump has been very supportive of President Erdogan, even through the S-400 situation. But, combining the Trump doctrine, where the United States wants to, withdraw its troops from around the world, and the coronavirus and the election upcoming, we have tremendous pressures on the executive branch and on Trump in particular to focus on domestic politics. I mean, we're very close to presidential election, and that is to the detriment, really, of the humanitarian disaster that exists in Syria. It's horrendous. But the question is, how does Turkey stabilize the situation without getting stuck in Syria in an impossible situation? So short term, it looks good. We've got the ceasefire. Long term is an imponderable, especially because of these other factors.
Well, people that are skeptical about this agreement between Moscow and Ankara have every right to be. That ceasefire, which has only been in place for a few hours now, there have already been reported violations. When we look at the previous agreements between Russia, Iran, Turkey, those have been violated. Turkey was basically put in those observation posts to monitor the de-escalation zone that is Idlib province. And again, we're seeing more violations of this. What are the dynamics right now that are happening between the Assad regime and Russia? I mean, what are the conversations that Russia has when the Assad regime launches those attacks and Turkey basically retaliates?
Well, I mean, the way I look at it is Turkey is being very courageous in Syria. It's trying very hard. And also, it has taken in almost 4 million refugees. And now, as a result of this situation, it's going to have a huge number of additional refugees, many of whom are going to be in zones in Syria. So Turkey's really stepped forward to help with this. But I think it's stuck in the middle of what you call this conversation, which is really Russia's affirmative support of the butchering, horrendous Syrian regime, which, as a Syrian friend of mine said, Assad kills his own people. I mean, that regime, and if you remember, the use of chemical weapons and all the things that the Syrian regime has done. Russia takes the position, if you see, that basically it's the Syrians who are doing all these terrible things and they're not doing anything. So they're behind that regime, and they're going to continue to be behind the regime so long as it serves their interests, and their interest is to maintain their bases and their base, and particularly in Tartus and the warm water port. That is their strategy. And if that means backing up the Syrian regime, then they're going to do that. That puts them in Russia diametrically in opposition to Turkey's interests in the region. So that's why I say, and I think that I'm hopeful that the U.S. and NATO can somehow step in. And I think President Erdogan, I think, hopefully appreciates, and I think NATO, even the NATO Secretary General, has been a stalwart supporter of Turkey and of President Erdogan, even through the S-400 issue, to show its support. And I think that you need that counterbalance against Russia, or else what you end up with is an asymmetric situation. Think about it this way. Turkey depends on Russia for resources. Turkey is working with Russia to build a nuclear plant in Akuyu. And then Turkey took this weaponry, this S-400. So it's become very tightly connected to Russia. It needs to disengage some of that, find other energy resources, and find other partners to develop its resources, and put aside the S-400 and get the Patriots. It needs those missiles, and it needs to get them from the United States. So I think there's a way out here, even with the domestic distractions that we see with President Trump. I think there are congressmen and the president who feel strongly that the situation needs to be stabilized. But going in the direction of Russia is, and again, I do understand why Turkey is doing that, and what is its choice. It needs to stabilize the situation. It did so with the ceasefire. That's very good. But long term, the road for the U.S. and NATO is the road that needs to be depended on. And I'm quite sure, and I think based on what we've seen with President Trump, he is a supporter of Turkey. He's been a supporter. He has not launched sanctions. He has done all sorts of things, much to the consternation of some of the senators and congressmen, and similarly the NATO Secretary General. So I think they've shown their loyalty to help Turkey in its difficult time. And this is the time in which this alliance is going to be proved. And it's going to prove that the U.S. alliance with Turkey is going to help Turkey to somehow get its way out of here and extricate itself from a very, very difficult situation, which is deteriorating. I mean, yeah, right now it's stable, but it doesn't look very, very promising for the future.
Well, I think you hit on a really important point there, Mark, which is the importance of the NATO alliance. All great points. Mark Meirowitz, great to have you with us. Thanks for that.